So now I am referring to the first line of the book. It's a bold claim. Fanon says, national liberation, national reawakening, restoration of the nation to the people, whatever the name used, whatever the latest expression. Decolonization is always a violent event. One thing you'll notice here is that Fanon has already tied up the question of decolonization with the question of the nation. And we'll see in a second, decolonization, Fanon thinks, has nation building as one of its aims. But at the same time, Fanon thinks there's another dimension to decolonization, and that this dimension is always violent. Now, what does he mean here by violent? I think the most basic meaning and the most defensible interpretation is Fanon claims that decolonization will be coercive in the sense of going against the will of the colonizer. So Fanon's notion is, in a colonial society, the great majority of the colonizers will be signing on to, let's call it the colonial social contract. They will consent to the way that their society, the colonial society, has been set up. And when the colonizer loses the will to stay in whatever colonial society they've set up, to stay in whatever land that they are currently occupying, then the game is up. Then the colonial society is already on its way to collapse, and decolonization has probably already been accomplished. So to be clear about this, Fanon is not saying every time two people interact in a colonial society, it's all bloodshed and violence and so forth. What Fanon is saying is this kind of society is put together in a violent way, and that this kind of society is maintained in a violent way. And this kind of society will only be taken apart against the will of the colonizer. And so now Fanon's going to give you a couple more specific arguments as to why decolonization is always violent in the broad sense of coercive. Strategically, Fanon doesn't think nonviolent decolonization is really a thing. Fanon thinks that tactics like boycotts, protests, and strikes have their limits. He thinks most of these tactics are good for getting concessions within the colonial system, but they are not useful for getting rid of the colonial system. They can't go beyond the colonial system. They actually work within the colonial system's framework. You can see this argument on page 27, where Fanon associates these tactics with what he calls moderate national parties. So moderate national parties are parties within a colonial society that are supposed to represent the interests of the native population. Okay, and what are these moderate national parties going to do? The moderate national parties are requested by the colonial powers to clearly articulate their claims and to calmly and dispassionately seek a solution with the colonial partner respecting the interests of both sides. So in contemporary terms, we call this both-sidism. And what does this mean? This means the moderate national parties say, hey, we, say native Algerians, we have some legitimate interests, and you, French Algerians, you have some legitimate interests. Let's come together and try and respect both of our legitimate interests. Now, Fanon is going to point out very quickly that this, of course, assumes that the entire system is basically just, or the overall arrangement doesn't have to be thrown out. Okay, and then Fanon goes on to say, when this nationalist reformist movement decides to act, it does so using extremely peaceful methods. You can just hear the sarcasm dripping from Fanon's tongue. Organizing work stoppages in the few factories located in the town, mass demonstrations to cheer on a leader, and a boycott of the buses or imported commodities. Okay, so these are all, they are ways of contesting and making demands, but Fanon says the problem is they do so within the parameters, within the basic limits of the colonial system. You're still basically asking for something from the colonial power. Say you want more representation within the national legislature, something like that. Okay, and well, if the colonial power isn't willing to grant that concession, well, then you have a boycott, or you have a march, or you have a strike. Fanon says all these methods not only put pressure on the colonial authority, but allow the people to let off steam. So they know, the colonialists know that the colonized people are mad. Yes, let them march down the street with a sign. That doesn't fundamentally threaten the basis of their power. Let them blow off the steam. This hibernation therapy, this hypnotherapy of the people sometimes succeeds. Succeeds according to whom? According to the colonial power. This is a failure, Fanon thinks, for the national liberation movement. In fact, the aim isn't really national liberation to begin with. Okay, so these forms of strategic interaction, these political strategies, they aren't going to work if your aim is actually national liberation, building the nation. Fanon says violence, as in a war for independence or a war of liberation, that not only lets the steam off, that actually gets you where you're trying to get going. Another argument that Fanon makes is more of a literary argument. Really, it's an argument in the vein of tragedy. And you can see what Fanon says, the story Fanon tells about a colonial society as a kind of tragedy. And the idea here is that the colonizing power, say the French in Algeria, used tremendous violence to conquer Algeria, to take it from the Ottoman Empire, to establish an entirely new colonial society outside of France in North Africa. So they put violence out into the world. They used violence to shape this society. They used violence to basically make history. And now the tragedy of it is the violence that the French Algerians have put out into the world is now coming back at them in the form of this French-Algerian war. So the violence you put out in the world comes back and it strikes you. You sometimes see this discussed in the scholarly literature around colonialism as a boomerang thesis, because you throw the boomerang at somebody else and it comes back and it hits you in the head. And there's a kind of tragedy to this. There's a kind of irony to this, insofar as this is definitely not what the colonizer wanted. There was a kind of hubris. There was a kind of arrogance involved, that the colonizer thought that they could build a society around violence, through violence, and so forth, without that violence coming back to harm themselves. Okay, so this is a tragic fate. It's ironic. And I've said here on the slide, it's comparable to what Marx says about the bourgeoisie. There's a similar irony and tragedy going on with bourgeois society. Marx says that the bourgeoisie produces the proletariat, and in producing the proletariat, they are giving rise to their own gravediggers. And it's the same argument in Fanon with the colonizer. Fanon claims that the colonizer produces the colonized. There was no colonial subject before these great European empires created colonial subjects. And if the colonial subject revolts and has a war of liberation and carries out successfully a revolution, that's, in a way, that's the chickens coming home to roost. Okay, so that's the tragic fate. And then there's the third argument, and I think this is actually the deepest argument that Fanon is trying to make. What he's saying is that the colonial situation is already steeped in violence, that a colonial society rules through brutal and excessive violence, that a colonial society is not set up in a way that allows for peaceful transformation. Okay, and then of course I can imagine the objection that, well, is any society really set up to have peaceful fundamental transformations? Like, think about how hard in the United States it is to even get a constitutional amendment passed. Okay, does any society really want its fundamentals changed or make it easy to have the fundamentals, say, of government changed? Not really. And then Fanon would say, that's no objection to what I'm saying. What I'm showing you is that in a society where the will of the people and the will of majority is supposed to prevail, even in that kind of society, it's very hard to get this peaceful social transformation. So imagine how much harder it is to have a peaceful social transformation, the transformation not only of one kind of government to another, a colonial government which basically overrepresents and favors the interests of the colonizer, to a government that represents more groups and more of the society on more equal terms. Okay, you're not just trying to change the form of government, Fanon says. You're trying to change the entire structure of society. You remember, Fanon's argument about colonial society is it's split into two. It's split into two. There's the foreigner and the native. There's the division of European and Arab, or in other parts, black and white, or black or white and Asian. Okay, and there's the class division too. Okay, there's all sorts of divisions, but the basic point is your society is cut into two, segregated, you could say, as apartheid systems in a particularly violent and antagonistic way. So the whole point of those systems is to maintain that kind of structure, that kind of domination. Those systems are not going to be easily, if at all, peacefully reformed. You're going to need a complete break with that kind of society. So Fanon's saying the colonial society began with violence, it's maintained through violence, and he thinks will only be ended through violence. Okay, and just to clarify my interpretation of Fanon, Fanon is not saying that violence is justified to in the course of the decolonization process. Fanon doesn't really see his aim as justifying violence, saying when it's legitimate to use violence, when it's not legitimate to use violence. That's more of an ethical framing. That's more of a normative judgment. That kind of thing, that kind of political theory is actually much more characteristic of somebody like John Locke, because you remember, the whole point in Locke is, when can you violently rebel against a tyrannical power? And Locke's basic answer was, when the government is no longer doing its job and is wielding some illegitimate power itself, then you can violently resist. Okay, but you can see that the whole question of violent uprising is framed as a question of justification. That is not how Fanon frames this question. Fanon is trying to describe what he thinks will happen in this kind of decolonization phase of history. So when you see the development over chapter 1 of decolonization, just starting as this dream of freedom and kind of in people's heads. You remember Fanon was talking about how many of his psychiatric patients would be talking about how they dreamed of movement and freedom of movement and all that. How you get from that point to a point where basically the colonized population is fed up with living in a colonial society. They're fed up with the deprivations and the humiliations and the poverty and the feeling of being inferiorized, of being made to feel inferior. And they're at the point where they are ready to take their history and their destiny in their own hands and fight a war of national liberation. Okay, so Fanon sees his own project as descriptive. So he wants to say, as a descriptive statement, here's why decolonization will always be, quote, violent. Another thing, and I think this is another important caveat, is Fanon is not trying to glorify violence. Although some claim that Fanon is actually trying to endorse violent revolutions, I'm not positive that Fanon is doing this. First of all, because as we saw, Fanon thinks there's something tragic about this decolonial violence, and he thinks it's tragic, especially on the part of the colonizers themselves, say the French Algerians. Okay, so there's a tragic fall of the colonizer. Okay, so that's one thing. And then another thing is, if you tend to think that Fanon is trying to glorify violence, not just justify it, but say, violence is this awesome and inspiring and liberating force and so forth, I would invite you to take a look at chapter 5 of Wretched of the Earth. Chapter 5 of Wretched of the Earth is where Fanon gets into some case studies. So I mentioned earlier that Fanon was a psychiatrist, and before he was an Algerian revolutionary, he was actually just seeing patients. And he was seeing patients on both sides of the conflict. So he was seeing French Algerians come in, say they worked for a police department, and they would ask Fanon things like, is it normal for me to wake up screaming in the middle of the night because I was thinking about the Algerian I was torturing to try and get information about where the weapons were stored and so forth? And he was also talking to Algerian revolutionaries because, remember, he gets there in the middle of the Franco-Algerian War, who would be saying things like, I feel a tremendous amount of guilt because my wife, whom I never really felt particularly attached to, was sexually violated by French soldiers who wanted to know where I was hiding. Okay, so Fanon, it's not like, abstractly violence is so great. Fanon talked to people about the actual effects of this violence on their lives, on their interpersonal relationships, and he realized there was quite a bit of trauma, actually. Trauma both for the colonizers and for the colonized. But he tends to think that this violent phase has got to be passed through. And when he says violence is necessary, he's saying it's necessary for, let's call it national independence to actually occur, to actually sweep away the colonial society. Okay, so that's my interpretation. Obviously, people disagree, and with a controversial figure like Fanon, you can imagine the disagreement gets quite intense. Okay, I want to talk about two things that we can find in the second half of chapter 1 of Wretched of the Earth. The first is decolonization as nation building. And the second is decolonization in the third world. Okay, so decolonization as nation building is the phase that comes after decolonization as war of liberation. So when Fanon is talking about decolonization always being a violent event, he's mostly referring to this war of liberation phase. So this is the point at which the colonized organize themselves and undertake armed combat. Okay. The second phase is facilitated by this war of liberation phase, but it's a distinct phase altogether. And the idea is actually pretty commonsensical. What the war of liberation is supposed to do is liberate you from this oppressive colonial society. What the nation building phase is supposed to do is to build up a new post-colonial society, a society that comes after colonialism, a society that doesn't take the shape of this, what Fanon calls Manichaean society, the society split violently into two. Fanon thinks that this first phase will be least supported by what he was calling a second ago the moderate national parties. But you can put this in more general terms as Fanon saying that the local elites, the native elites, believe that violence against, say, the French, or whatever the colonizing power happens to be, is not going to work. So Fanon, when he's saying decolonization is necessary, decolonization is only going to work through violence, the local elites say, no, Fanon, what are you talking about? What is this unreasonable guy from the Caribbean saying here? This is not going to work. It's not going to work because the technological and the military advantage of the French in Algeria is overwhelming, and the local Algerians cannot win against that. The French have planes and tanks, automatic machine guns, sophisticated radio and surveillance technologies. The French, in this period, even got the atomic bomb, which, non-coincidentally, they exploded in the Sahara Desert in Algeria. Okay, and sorry, I don't mean to sound conspiratorial, but the French wanted Algerians and other North Africans to know that they had the atomic bomb. Okay, and so the local elites are asking, are you really going to beat all that? You're not. When it comes to a military confrontation, the native Algerians cannot win. You cannot win. So the idea is, let's negotiate within the colonial system. Let's try and get more seats in the Algerian legislature. Let's try and get more rights under the French law. Let's try and negotiate with the Europeans for European-style reforms, for reforms that within the colonial system will make the native population more equal to the European population. Okay, and then we've already seen Fanon argues that they're going to organize national parties precisely for these reform-oriented aims. And they're going to organize these parties in the cities. Okay, so the geographic base of power for these local elites is going to be, say, Algiers or other big cities. Okay. Fanon thinks that the local masses have a very different attitude. And when you see Fanon talking about how he himself thinks violence will work, Fanon believes that he is expressing the belief of the overwhelming majority of the colonized population. They have more faith in their own ability to wage a successful war of liberation, this first phase of decolonization. They do not think that the seemingly overwhelming technical and military advantage of, say, the French in Algeria is going to be the decisive factor. Because as Fanon points out, really, the decolonization process is a contest of wills. It's a contest of wills. Are the French really committed to staying in Algeria? How committed are the French to saying Algeria is part of France, and 100 years from now it's going to be a part of France, and 200 years from now it'll be a part of France? Well, if Fanon were around today, as we mentioned, he died pretty young, before the age of 40. I think Fanon would say, yeah, I've been vindicated. Look, Algeria is not part of France right now. Algeria is an independent country. And then the question is, how did that happen? Because at first, France wasn't about to leave willingly. They were not about to just pack it up after being in Algeria for 130 years or 120 years when the national independence movement started. Okay, so what changed their mind? And Fanon's idea is you have to wear the colonizer out. You have to make the costs of staying in Algeria unacceptably high. And you've got to use the weapons and the means and the tactics at your disposal that will raise the costs of the French occupation and take lives, to make it very expensive, to turn the opinion in France, for example, against staying. Okay? And what are the tactics at your disposal? What are the weapons of the weaker military power? And Fanon mentions a couple of them, but I'll just mention guerrilla warfare was one of those. Guerrilla warfare was used to great effect against the French in what was called Indochina by the French, what is now Vietnam. Okay, so the Vietnam independence movement knew that if they just, had two sides, two armies marching at each other straight head on, that they were going to lose. Okay, but they also knew that if they snuck and hid and fought in the jungles and struck and then retreated, or struck and then retreated in the hills, or struck and then retreated in the village, and you can't even tell who's a soldier and who's not a soldier, that they'd be at an advantage. Okay, and very similar tactics were used against American forces in Vietnam. Okay, so that's one of them. And another tactic Fanon mentions is the use of terror or political terror. Because here, it doesn't matter if the French have, for example, overwhelming aerial advantage, airplanes, and the Algerians haven't got any airplanes, and the French, if they wanted, could just drop bombs from the sky. But if you've got people who are basically willing to die for the independence cause, they can carry a bomb. And they can carry it into the European quarters. And they can set the bomb off. They will, in a way, commit suicide, but they also take out French settlers. And once again, the idea is to erode the will of the French to stay, to make the cost of staying unacceptably high. And so the masses do have some reason for believing that this violence will work. Without the benefit of hindsight, which is, of course, 2020. Their spontaneous instinct, almost, is to say that this violence will work. And Fanon says that this spontaneous revolt is actually going to give birth to the nation, is going to bind individuals and factions into a kind of national project, a project to create a new nation. Because as we mentioned, prior to being part of the French Empire, Algeria was part of the Ottoman Empire. There was no national nation state there. So this is what Fanon says on page 50, if you want to follow along in the Grove edition. Fanon says, violent praxis, and that just means practice. So violent practice is totalizing, since each individual represents a violent link in the great chain, in the almighty violence rearing up in reaction to the primary violence of the colonizer. So first, Fanon is saying this is a kind of counter-violence. It's a violence which is in reaction on the part of the colonized. It's a reaction to the violence of the colonizer. And then you notice here that Fanon says individuals are linked, and they're so tightly linked, it's as if they were links in a great chain. Fanon goes on to say, factions recognize each other, and the future of the nation is already indivisible. So maybe when everything was just theoretical and Algerians were just debating and writing in newspapers and maybe talking on the radio, hey, do we want independence or whatever? Maybe there was a lot of difference of opinion there, a lot of different feelings, different polls and so forth showing different levels of support for independence. But Fanon thinks when things really get kicked off, when it really becomes as serious as fighting a war and killing and dying, these various factions will come together. They will become, as he puts it, a future nation already indivisible. Final sentence of this paragraph runs, the armed struggle mobilizes the people, pitches them in a single direction from which there is no turning back. Okay, so this is the spontaneous phase. This is almost the spontaneous revolt. And of course, you can already see the sort of outlines of the future nation in this revolt. But Fanon says this spontaneity is not enough. Okay, so the local elites were organizing in the cities. Fanon thinks that organizing has to happen among the national independence movement. A revolt is not a revolution. A revolt is just kind of this spontaneous, almost instinctual uprising. But the revolution is a sustained and a prolonged process. And it's not fundamentally about violence. That's just the first phase, the War of Liberation. It's the second phase that is the most important. It's the second phase that requires actual leadership. It's the second phase that requires actual planning. Okay, and so Fanon thinks that the local masses have to come into contact with a kind of revolutionary leadership of people like Fanon, for example, of people who are able to sort of shape and articulate these local beliefs and these local aspirations into something like a long-lasting plan with a strategy on how to achieve the plan and a sort of a sort of leadership which will fuse with the local masses in order to achieve the goal of building up the nation. Okay, so this is just another way of saying that the aim of decolonization is actually to surpass violence, to build up the nation. Okay, you've got to move from phase 1, War of Liberation, into phase 2, nation building, or else your decolonization process has hit a dead end. If it's just constant fighting and constant warfare, and let's say during the War of Liberation, the nation doesn't start acting as one and instead just falls apart into factions, or if individuals are no longer willing to be a part of this collective project and they just go back to their ordinary lives and become individuated again, well then things have obviously stalled, and according to Fanon, something's gone wrong because you haven't moved forward into the nation building phase of things. Okay, so what is the nation building form, the nation building project? Well, as I've already mentioned, the nation building project is to create a new nation. It's to give birth to a new nation that wasn't there before. It's to create a new kind of national consciousness and a new kind of citizenship that couldn't have existed under the old colonial regime, under the idea that Algeria was just a part of France and a subordinate part of France. Now, the objection Fanon has to deal with is, won't these new nations just be kind of pale imitations of the European nations that were once oppressing them? And the reason a lot of people make this objection is they point out that this nation state form or this nation state system was actually set up by Europeans, and that prior to Europeans inventing this nation state form for themselves, there were a lot of different kinds of ways of organizing political communities. You could organize them into tribes. You could organize them into bands. You could organize them into kingdoms. You could organize them into great empires. You could organize them in a whole lot of different ways. And really what modernity is about is turning all this diversity of forms into these giant nation states. Okay, and so some might object, well, these aren't traditional. This nation state thing is not really traditional to North Africa. It's not really traditional to Southeast Asia. Why are we trying to build this? Aren't you, in a way, imitating your oppressor? Aren't you going to run into all the same problems with this nation state that the European nation states have, like great inequalities of wealth and people feeling like their governments really aren't theirs, that their governments are just these centralized powers way off in the capital, and so forth? Well, Fanon says, yeah, maybe, and that's definitely a problem. And he thinks that if decolonization doesn't fulfill its promise, yes, you will basically turn into a pale imitation of the European nations. But Fanon says, if you have a proper understanding of what this new kind of nation is going to be, what this new kind of post-colonial nation will be, you can see that it takes into account some of the problems of the European nations in a way that goes beyond the European nations. So Fanon is not saying, let's just do what Europe did. Fanon is saying, let's take this political form, the modern nation state, and let's, as it were, make it our own. Okay, how can this be done? First thing Fanon says is nation building has got to be an economic project. So there's an economic dimension to the nation, and you're not really talking about nation or nationality or national liberation unless you're also talking about a national economy and how you build up a national economy, how you develop a national economy. Because remember, part of what being a colony meant in the middle of the 20th century was usually malnutrition, illiteracy, lack of electricity, lack of clean water, low calorie counts, all that. It was underdevelopment, basically. And this is why we often talk about the formerly colonized world as the underdeveloped world or the developing world. And definitely part of the reason they are in that position is due to colonization. Not all of it, but part of it. Okay, so how do you get out of this situation? Fanon asks. Fanon says trade is not going to do it. So there's one developmental model where basically the idea is you try and find your niche in the global economy and you try to produce for the world market. You produce for exports, basically. And countries, for example, like Taiwan or South Korea, they had an export-oriented strategy. And this, some say, is how they developed very rapidly. Fanon has his doubts about this strategy, especially for North African countries like Algeria, and you can see why. Fanon's idea is, well, in a way, Algeria has already been producing for the world market. In a way, it's not uncommon for Algerians, Fanon mentions, to have never eaten the grapes that they spend the whole day growing in Algeria and picking off the vines and so forth. Because those grapes are then exported to France, where they eat them or make wine or who knows, does whatever. Okay, so there's already global trade going on in Algeria. And Fanon is saying, wouldn't it be better if instead of producing for the world market and for other consumers, local industries started to build themselves up? And isn't this better if we can start growing food for ourselves, for example, and eating the fruits of our own labor and eating the fruits, the literal fruits that we grow on our own land? Okay, so there's this idea here about self-sufficiency, and there's this idea here about being economically independent. It's standing on your own feet, economically speaking. So what Fanon wants to avoid is what's called extractivism, where, and we talked about this in the case of Britain in India, the British in India. The idea there was global trade. What did it mean when India was part of the British Empire? What did global trade mean? It meant that the British took the cotton grown in India, shipped it to Lancashire, shipped it to the UK, built it up, processed it, turned it into textiles, and then took those textiles and sold them back into India. And what is this kind of global trade, this kind of colonial global trade, who does it benefit? It's not for the benefit of the Indians, it's for the benefit of the British. And so Fanon has a certain skepticism towards these trade-oriented strategies. And at the same time, Fanon says you don't grow an economy for the sake of growth. So one thing that, and this is still true today, is some economists, when they want to gauge the health of an economy, what they do is they look at GDP and GNP. Those are just acronyms, gross domestic product, gross national product. I myself forget the technical difference between them, but they're a way of gauging how much the economy as a whole, the national economy as a whole, has grown from one year to another. And so if you've got 10% growth in 1 year, that's considered very high and very good. And if you've got 1% growth or 0% growth, that is considered a problem, especially if you believe in capitalist economics, where the whole point is growth. Okay? So Fanon would say, we shouldn't be talking about growth for the sake of growth. What we should talk about is the national economy meeting the needs of the people? Because you can grow an economy, and if all the wealth produced just goes straight to the top, Fanon would say you're just reproducing the problems of these European nation states, which have huge class inequality, for example. Okay, so what Fanon says is, if you want to talk about real growth in a post-colonial nation, you're going to be talking about how many calories are the poorest people out in the countryside and, in these rural villages. How many calories a day do they have access to, realistically speaking? Can they afford the food that they produce? Do they have access to clean water? Do they have electricity so at night they can turn on the light and read a book? And let's make sure that these kids are in school instead of working in a field all day. Those problems of development, those are the problems that you need to address when you're building up a new nation, economically speaking. And you can see the basic idea is you've got to be independent, and you cannot be independent if the least well-off in your nation are not having the basic needs met. Okay, nation building at the same time isn't only economic. Okay, so there is this kind of idea that, yes, basic needs, that's the fundamentals. Okay, but there's also this idea that nation building has a cultural component to it. You've got to cultivate a sense of nationality. Okay, and although that sense of nationality may have begun in the War of Liberation, where Fanon says the factions recognize each other and the individuals are bound together in a kind of community of fate, you've actually got to go beyond that into the second phase, where you're trying to get people who are not used to seeing themselves as fellow citizens and fellow Algerians as such. Okay, so there's this cultural dimension, and this cultural dimension is just as important as the economic dimension. Now, Fanon says some people in African and Asian nations are going to basically stress the importation of European culture, European literature, for example, European languages, European science and technology, stress the importation of European capital and investments. Okay, and again, Fanon is saying all that is a kind of symptom of a colonized and dependent mentality. A sort of lack of faith that, hey, the Algerians, we can build up our own nation, our own national culture, and so forth. Okay, so Fanon doesn't think that's the way forward for a new African or Asian nation. So he does not stress imitation. He believes in the fundamental creativity of people in Africa, of people in Asia, to basically forge their own path and not have to borrow culture and civilization and so forth, basically assimilate into European civilization or import the European civilization into these other non-European places. So he wants creativity. And in this vein, Fanon is also not a traditionalist. So the traditionalist basically says, we, whoever we happen to be, we need to go back to our glorious past. And we need to go back and recreate our glorious empires. And we need to go back and recapture the spirit of the past before the colonizer got here. And so they can only conceive of decolonization as a return to pre-colonial times. And Fanon is saying, yeah, I understand. I understand that tendency. Fanon says, when some European colonizer gets to North Africa and says, you're a bunch of savages, it's almost a natural instinct to say, well, no, look at our thousands of years of civilization. Islamic art, of great African empires, and so forth. Fanon says that's almost a natural tendency. But Fanon says that's not going to cut it for decolonization. Because he says, just look at what happened in Vietnam. Were the Vietnamese bragging about their cultural achievements in the past, or were they oriented towards the future and confident in their ability to forge their own future? So it's this kind of past-oriented decolonization that Fanon is arguing against, and it's this kind of future-oriented decolonization that Fanon is in favor of. And again, the big point here is Fanon, he's all about creating the future. He's all about these newly independent nations, and he doesn't say exactly how he thinks they should be set up in any of that, because that would sort of go against his commitment to creativity. But what he wants to, at the bottom level, affirm is that these new African and Asian nations can do it for themselves.